Welcome. We hear it said plenty of times that scientists never study UFO phenomenon because it is ridiculous. Is this true? Today is Thursday, December 5th, and in What's Up With That, we're discussing the UFO history and also the Vedic view. The history will be kind of a history, at least in the United States, of the UFO phenomenon and how it has played out. And we'll only begin with the earlier part of the history. And this is What's Up With That. We're here every Thursday at 7 to 8:30 p.m. at 26 2nd Avenue, which is 26 2nd Avenue, and East 1st Street in downtown Manhattan. So if you hear about this on YouTube and you're interested, you live in the New York area, we're here. We don't every Thursday do a What's Up With That, but some Thursdays we do stories from the Vedas, which are a little different. So you have to stay up with Meetup to find out which type of thing we'll be discussing on a particular day. Eventually I hope to have a WhatsApp group and a few other things to help this, but this is our UFO series. It started last week when we talked about the introduction to UFOs and ufology, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper. So this YouTube channel, if you saw this somewhere outside of the YouTube channel, is called Krishna Was Up, KRISHNAWAZZUP. All right, so this is a very unusual topic, and it brings in a lot of things, as we were saying last week. This is like at the intersection of many controversial topics. Travel to other galaxies, cryptids, the paranormal in general, psychic phenomena, psychokinesis, and a number of different things. So UFOs in general have a very dodgy history because, of course, we can't study them directly. We can only study them when they decide to show themselves. So therefore, we are not able to study them the way we might want to. And this brings us into another topic. Let's take first, before I get off into discussing the phenomenon itself, let's get into just what I hope to cover today. And this is what we are going to work with. An overview, which is what I'm giving you right here. A scientific study of UFOs. What scientists have studied the UFO phenomena? At least we're going to talk 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, kind of in that range of time. And we're going to also talk about the U.S. military, how the military has dealt with the phenomenon of UFOs. We're going to talk about J. Allen Hynek, whose story actually, in one sense, brings to light a number of different issues that are there in the discussion of UFOs. We're also going to talk about, this is the second part, the Vedic view of universal control, the demigods, alternative technologies, the 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy. So I purposefully decided to break this session today, and I might do this for all future sessions, into two parts, because I'm trying to keep these down into shorter, more easily visible, easy to assimilate subsections. So especially with the Vedic view, it's kind of good to bounce back and forth between that which is unfamiliar yet described and talked about in familiar terms with the Vedic view, which is unfamiliar and talked about in, for most people, unfamiliar terms. If you're a devotee and you're watching this, then that won't be true. But for most people, I think that either UFOs are familiar and the Vedic view is not, or else The Vedic view is familiar for some of you, and UFOs are not. You've never really thought about them very much or had much discussion or read much about the subject. But the subject was quite voluminously explored by Dr. Richard Thompson, or Sataputta as we know him. And we talked about that in a book called Alien Identities, which is a book he wrote some years ago. It's an older book, but it does actually discuss many important and relevant things. So let's talk about the overall idea of this premise that people have, that scientists don't study UFOs. At least real scientists don't. Ufology has been a very disreputable subject, a very difficult subject, and as a result, many people are afraid to have their names associated with it. And just to give an understanding of that, in his book, Alien Identities, Richard Thompson describes the idea of how some people will go way out of their way just to make sure that they are not, somehow or another, their name doesn't come up in relation to UFOs, either having seen one or supporting the idea that there might be such things, because they feel they'll lose their credibility, they may lose their job, they may lose their position, and personally they may be placed in a position of ridicule. For this reason, people often have difficulties. So one case story is this John Henry Altshuler. In 1967, he was living in Denver, Colorado, and there was a area nearby, a national park, and he'd heard that some people had seen UFOs in that area. So he decided to check it out, see if he could see anything. So he went there, and yes, he actually did see something on the Sangre de Cristo mountain, something, one or two things that were lights up at the top of the mountains, but he knew that there were no roads up there, so there were no cars up there. And when he was doing that, as he was involved in getting away from the national park, he was caught. And so the park rangers, they found out that actually he was a hematologist. So that means he studies blood and things like that. And they brought him to examine a strangely mutilated horse. And he begged them not to associate his name either with the explanation of the horse or with where they found him or what he might have seen. He did not want to have his name attached to these things. He was deathly afraid it would wreck his reputation. This is a kind of warranted fear, actually. It's not some kind of phobia. It's a warranted fear because any time a person gets associated with UFOs and ufology, if they're not willing to take the consequences, it could have a devastating effect on their lives. Some people are willing to roll with the punches or don't care. But some people, their very job may be called into question as a result. Of course, we see this other interesting angle that an animal was mutilated. This is another aspect of the whole UFO phenomenon, that sometimes we see that the UFOs, they have an effect on animals. These animals are savagely killed in a way that makes no sense. That there's no blood found, even though you would imagine if you're making big cuts into large animals like horses and cows, that there would be lots of blood everywhere, but there's no blood ever found. And the cuts are razor sharp and in straight lines. And strange parts of the creature are cut out for reasons that nobody can explain or understand, which make no sense from any motivations of human beings that we generally can think of. So at any rate, that's another aspect in itself, which I don't want to discuss today, but we will discuss in the future. So Stephen Broad, or Brade, I'm not sure how the name is pronounced, University of Maryland, wrote that in general, we find that people find themselves distancing from this UFO phenomenon. Even psychologists distance themselves from studying psychokinesis, because especially large objects, because there's this general disparity between what we know about science, the kind of science is very well accepted, and the kind of obvious things that this phenomenon seems to bring us into. So we have to talk about some science or some kind of reality that is beyond what everyday scientists will agree is possible. Now, just because something's not possible in our own present technology doesn't mean it's not possible, period. Why this is such a sticking point, I have no idea. But it's quite obvious that things we can do today would have been considered magical even 60 or 100 years ago, what to speak of even 20 years ago, some cases. So the fact that people who claim to be scientists or claim to be speaking for science will make flat disavowals of possibilities based on their present thinking and the present understanding of science seems unscientific. So because science is advancing and new technologies are brought to the fore and the possibilities are expanded, what we can imagine is either science hidden from us, possibly, the UFO phenomenon, science that actually we do possess on Earth but is not made public, or else science of some other group of living beings which we don't have yet, is just written off. Why? Because it falls outside the box, of what current scientists consider to be possible or practical. And we kind of see these kind of things in these kind of cases that this William Moskowitz describes, that this idea of travel. I forget whether it was him or one of these others, Hudson Hoagland. These ideas of travel to other galaxies, because it's assumed that these beings could not be coming from our own solar system, and it's also assumed they couldn't be coming from Earth. Maybe they've lived here for a long time. Actually, that's the idea the Vedas have, that some of these races are not really extraterrestrials. They've been here as long as we have, or maybe even longer. But this idea that they must be coming from another galaxy, therefore they must be traveling with some kind of long-term arrangement, because they couldn't get here fast. Why? Because our rockets can't go that fast, as if they necessarily have to be traveling with rocket technology, as if they necessarily have to be coming from a faraway galaxy, as if there might not be other ways to get from one part of the universe to the other without this kind of narrow understanding of what it means to travel according to present technology, according to present rocket science, according to present speeds, according to present discussions of propulsion. So obviously, this is just narrow-minded thinking and nothing else. But we see that usually when it's written up in professional books, that people make these cases against the possibility of long-range travel. They make this case against the possibility of extraterrestrials, of UFOs, based on assumptions that certainly can't be proved, and assumptions that are based on current technologies and methodologies that certainly will at some point be overstepped by even our own earthly science, what to speak of who knows who else's science. So Edward U. Condon with the University of Colorado was commissioned with a $500,000 grant from the U.S. government to issue a report about things that have been coming in. We're going to talk about that in the next section in a minute when we talk about the military, because the military originally started out with Project Sign, headed up by Edward Ruppelt, and he garnered many reports from servicemen and other sources discussing and trying to arrive at, were these reports credible? If so, where were these objects coming from? And if so, did they present a threat of some type or another? So naturally, this was a reasonable way of looking at things. And then this gradually turned into what we called Project Grudge, and finally Project Blue Book. At the end of Project Blue Book, we have this Condon report coming out, which kind of summarized the whole thing. And, spoiler alert, of course, probably no one's ever going to read the Condon report. But at any rate, basically they concluded that mostly it's just weather balloons and sightings of things that people who are not technically trained have misrepresented or misunderstood to be some kind of extraterrestrial craft, but in fact are more prosaic things, as we just described, stars or flares or who knows what. And there is no real possibility of any kind of worry. There's no real reason to worry or even study these things. Why? Because there's nothing to them. And it will not further human knowledge in any particular way, nor is there any danger, although they admit that some residue of these phenomenon are not explainable. However, in their minds, the way they put it in the Condon report, it appears that these phenomena are not explainable, not because they could be extraterrestrials, or we could be talking about technology beyond our own, but rather that there's just not enough information to debunk them. That's all. That's how they really view it. So at any rate, this was the Edward Condon. And after he finished his report, which I think was somewhere around 1967 or something like that, Hudson Hoagland did a write-up. These kind of write-ups happen for various scientific publications, and they're discussed in various scientific associations like the American Association for the Advancement of Science and these kind of groups. And it describes, that this phenomenon of extraterrestrials, and there's a deliberate strategy of associating it with mediums and with other things which most people assume must be fraudulent or certainly not very credible subjects. Hoagland ties it in with, he talks about how Harry Houdini, and he debunks some mystic. Of course, I'm sure some mystics can be debunked, and these things are not at all easy to study either. But there's a deliberate attempt to tie this in with phenomena that most people will feel, oh yeah, and roll their eyes, So why they do that is not accidental. There's a deliberate strategy that way. So Hoagland did that just to make sure that if anyone had thought that there might be some credibility to UFOs, that they would not think that anymore. The upshot of this is that many of these speakers and writers, these talking heads of our everyday world, try to paint a picture that these phenomenon are not easy to study, and we shouldn't bother studying them because we've discovered, and the military's not worried about them, and we've read these reports, and most of them are really not very important and just mistakes. And you get the sense, too, that no credible scientist has ever really witnessed these things, which is a flat-out lie. You know, that what we do find out, if we study this according to some of these researchers, including some of them, even though they themselves don't believe in the UFO phenomenon as being something extraterrestrial, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH, they still believe that there's something mysterious going on. And the question may be raised, well, what are these things, and is it really true that no technical people ever have these experiences? Of course, now, at the time that this book was written, it was kind of hard to believe, but now many people have stepped forward from the military, from various technical and very credible background, describing their own experiences with UFO in the military, in some kind of other technical field. And we're becoming aware of the fact that sometimes the best UFO accounts come from very technically learned people who have studied aircraft, people who have studied velocity and propulsion technologies, people who have studied various kinds of photography, who have studied distancing, who have studied weapons and ordnance, and who have studied the flight characteristics of various known aircraft of various kinds. These are people who are not guessing about things the way someone might. A person who sees a streak in the sky and can tell you what kind of airplane that is, or people who are pilots themselves. And when we get these kind of reports, we begin to see that there's been an elaborate effort to debunk this whole phenomenon, and also to, as much as possible, push this into the marginal, the fringe area, so that people will not be very interested in studying it. And if they do, they'll be considered one of those people who studies fringe things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute when we talk about the phenomenon of the military. Okay, so I want to move through this. There are several agencies that have been, of course, united by people who, in fact, are scientists sometimes themselves, though the agencies have no scientific standing, like MUFON and SUFOS, which was actually started by J. Allen Hynek. And there's a story here, of course, that GPAN is a publicly, not a government, but a publicly funded group in France. And of course, NICAP, which was the original organization to study the UFO phenomenon, which, as far as I know, no longer exists. Clyde Tombaugh is not your ordinary person. He was the one who discovered the planet Pluto. Of course, it's not a planet anymore, but at any rate, he had an experience. And of course, you can see that many people who do know what they're talking about have a way of wanting to get their voice heard, even though they understand the possible repercussions that could come from it. We hear in general, oftentimes the idea put forward that, well, if we have so many telescopes in the sky always looking, but they never see UFOs. And of course, partly the field of view of a telescope is so narrow that it's not likely they're going to see a UFO. And since they're focused on such a far distant point, that if a UFO flew by, they would just see an immediate quick obstruction and nothing more. And of course, in fact, there are people who are observers and astronomers who have witnessed UFO phenomenon at different points. And of course, there are larger research. There's research going on larger scope where they judge the glow of the night sky. And generally, these are bigger in their scope than just the telescopes. But again, these are routinely done not for gauging UFOs, but for some other purpose. And generally, the stars are played down. They're underdrawn so that even if there was a UFO, it would not be visible in the data that they're collecting. At any rate, these are described in the book by Thompson. And we find that a person like Jacques Vallée, who eventually would work with J. Allen Hynek, became interested in the UFO phenomenon when he saw some of the people at the observatory he was with erasing footage of a UFO. And he asked them why they were doing it, and they said they didn't want to bring discredit on their observatory. So he could understand that they took it seriously, but they didn't want anybody else to know so that they would not be put into a difficult spot, lose their funding or whatever. So let's move quickly here to U.S. Air Force investigation. So there was Project Sign, which originally was to gather information about the possibility of UFOs, sightings, people's testimonies, etc., from outside and inside the military. And then we had Project Grudge. How are you doing? What's that? Yes, come on in. Yeah, today we're discussing UFOs a bit. You were just walking by, or? Yeah. You can take your shoes off there and have a seat. And we're doing this every Thursday, actually. We have a section of presentations known as What's Up With That, where we're talking about the paranormal. And right now we're into a whole section about UFOs and ufology, and I was just describing some of these, the history, at least in the United States, of how the UFO phenomenon became notable and how people take it today. We kind of went back to, Kenneth Arnold, and we talked about the original sightings, and we talked about scientists particularly who had studied UFOs and how they were viewed. And here we're up to this section where we're talking about U.S. Air Force investigations, starting with Project Sign, which was commissioned by the U.S. government to study the UFO phenomenon. And it led into another thing called Project Grudge, which led into yet another thing called Project Blue Book. And so Project Sign, Ruppelt, Edward Ruppelt, who was the, I think, main military coordinator for Project Sign, was open-minded about the idea. But then when it gradually became Project Grudge, at that point, there was a deliberate attempt to label all kinds of UFO phenomenon as being somehow either mistaken, illusory, fraudulent, or some other category, or the kind of grab bag of things that we can't debunk, but we know that if we had enough information, we could debunk them. So that's how Project Grudge is. I don't know if that's how it got its name, but at any rate, that's what it segued into. Then we had Project Blue Book after that, and after that came out the Condon Report, which we see here. It was $500,000 by the U.S. government to the University of Colorado with this Edward Condon. And essentially the bottom line of it was that, yeah, there's all this stuff out there, and we can't explain every bit of it, but mostly it's just weather balloons and swamp gas and planets that people don't know are there, and this kind of thing, possibly lights that are reflections where there's some change in the density of the atmosphere at a high level and there's reflections. And at any rate, this also led to the Robertson panel, which wasn't so public, and the Robertson panel concluded that there's a real danger here, not from UFOs, but a danger from the public, that if people get too stewed up about this, then either it could cause a mass hysteria, or that it might cause people to flood government responsive agencies with requests for some information, and therefore hamper our national military defense strategies. So there was a effort there made with the Robertson panel to make a systematic educational system to kind of educate people that these things are not real. Let me take a bit of water here. So this is actually how, by degrees, the whole idea of UFOs went from something that people were interested in to something that was fringe, to something that the military actually made a concerted and deep effort to erase in some kind of way. So they created a lot of talking heads and reports and people with the sole mission to spread disinformation. Of course, their pretext, the pretext of the Robertson panel, was that this is a danger to national security, not from the UFOs, but from the people in general. But the real idea, of course, the obvious idea here is that if you have things flying around in our sky, and the U.S. military, the Air Force especially, can't do anything about it, this is a serious thing. You know, they don't want to go on record describing why it is that they can't do anything about these things flying in the sky. So this is their real reason, and this is why the government has so strongly, for such a long time, come out with this debunking concept, you know, that anything that comes forward, they pushed it into the background. Okay, so I want to move up here because, again, I'm going much longer than I always wanted to. This is John Allen Hynek, you know, astronomer. He was initially a skeptic. He didn't believe in UFOs, and he was following the party line of the U.S. military, and he was part as an advisor for Project Grudge and Project later Blue Book. And I think he was involved also with the Condon Report to some extent. And so over this time, he became gradually more and more acquainted with credible reporters. In other words, people who were military personnel, people who were scientifically trained, coming forward and saying things about this whole phenomenon. And he began to question this party line that he was being forced to speak for. Although in the beginning he kept the party line, at least as official documents, in his own personal testimony. Sometimes he would speak otherwise. And eventually he just couldn't hold that anymore. And he founded CUFOS, or the CUFOS. I think it's... I forget what the C stands for, UFO, Committee for UFO something or another, I forget. Eventually he also ran across Betty and Barney Hill, which were one of the earlier and more straight ahead, very interesting abduction stories, you know, about how they were traveling on a highway and they had 4 hours of missing time. And later on, they were hypnotized separately, and they told the same story about having been abducted by a UFO. And in this way, we see someone who was trying to evaluate, trying to be open-minded about it, but he was pressured by the military, and in the beginning was actually skeptical himself, but later went to the complete other extreme, where he began to write about UFOs and investigate them himself. And his name is still well known. He was associated with Jacques Vallée, who was a similar kind of investigator.